Tak jo, slyšíme se. Já vás teda moc nevidím kvůli reflektorům, ale slyším, že vás je tady hodně,
very well, but I can hear there are lots of you, which is great news.
Já vás vítám na pokračování.
Welcome everyone to the follow-up of the program at the Inspiration Forum. I'm Petr Bittner. I'm a journalist.
Mému hostovi dneska jsem jeho překladatel.
And I'm also the translator of our guest today, of his books.
Kterýho si jako vážím nesmírně, protože to
I really appreciate this task today to introduce this topic at the festival of Ji.hlava and to introduce this guest, Srnicek. Dr. Srnicek has Czech roots, but he was born in Canada.
Přijato i na druhé straně,
This is
protože si prostě nemůžu pomoct.
Very exceptional.
To vyslovuje v zámoří, ale prostě
I can't help myself. I just use Czech pronunciation of Srnicek, not Srnicek. He wrote 2 bestsellers. The first one is Platform Capitalism. It's a small book published in 2017.
Je vlastně prvním pokusem o takovou
And this is the first try to analyze the new economic model emerging in the state today. And the second book is called Emerging, Inventing the Future. And I think you can even buy it here at the festival. It was published by Masaryk Academy, so you can even buy it here. And there is another book that is supposed to be published next year. The co-writer is Helen Hester. The name is After Work. We are expecting this book coming soon, and it is focusing on the new emerging technologies and also the economic questions linked to that. It is focused on the society, on family, on care, etc. And what will we talk about today? I chose some of the topics from those 3 books by Srnicek. I chose a few general questions that I'll ask Nick, and I will try to give him some space for presenting his thinking to us. I hope there'll be also space for the discussion with you. The Q&A will start about 30 minutes before the end of this lecture. I guess that's everything for the introduction, but we have Nick waiting on Zoom, so I think it's a good idea to pass the floor to him, and I'll ask him the first question. How was the new economic model of platforms born, and why is it so revolutionary? In what sense?
Yeah, so I wrote Platform Capitalism, the short little book, in many ways as a trying to get clear to myself what exactly platforms were and what they were doing to the capitalist economic system. At a very basic level, a platform is simply definable as an intermediary, which means that it brings together different groups. So take Facebook, for example. It brings together users on one hand, advertisers on the other side, but you've also got companies, you've got app developers, all these different groups who are coming together on the platform and interacting on the Facebook platform. I should say it's Meta platform now. They changed their name yesterday. But this is the idea of what a platform is that it is fundamentally about bringing different groups together, which is quite distinct from a traditional business model where you take a sort of series of inputs, say, the parts of a car, you turn them into an output, a car, and then you sell it on to a consumer. With a platform, it's not about that sort of transformation of inputs into a particular output. Instead, it's about bringing all these different groups together. Now, what I find really fascinating about platforms and why I ended up studying them is because if we look at all the most powerful and wealthy companies in the world today, they're all platforms, with the possible exception of Apple, but I don't want to get into that debate right now. But Facebook, Amazon, Google, Alibaba, Tencent, these companies are all first and foremost platforms. And the question for me when I was writing the book was, what is it about this business model which is so attractive to these companies, and what allows them to dominate not just their particular markets, but actually to continue to sort of spread out across the entire economic system and grow their power. And the key sort of answer to that has to do with network effects. The idea that the more people who are using a platform, the more valuable it becomes. So, for instance, take a classic example of a telephone network. If only 10 people have a telephone in the entire world, that network is not very valuable. There's only a handful of people you can call. If there's 7 billion people with a smartphone, suddenly that same telephone network is incredibly valuable because you can get in touch with anybody. The same thing happens with a company like Facebook. The more people that are involved in a Facebook or Instagram or TikTok or any of these platform companies, the more valuable it becomes for everybody that's involved. Now, what that does is that it incentivizes these companies to grow as large as possible, and it incentivizes users and consumers and companies and advertisers to continue to grow onto the biggest platforms. And you end up with a situation where one platform, or possibly two, tends to dominate any individual market that they sort of take place in. So for me, this was really interesting. I think it's fundamentally a change in business models in capitalism, but another core part of my argument is also that it remains capitalism. I think there's a lot of arguments, particularly from sort of more optimistic accounts, that actually we're seeing something different from capitalism. Somebody like Mackenzie Ward, for instance, will say that we're living through something worse, that is approaching a sort of almost a quasi-feudal system. But actually, I think profits are still central to the system. The economic control of workers and the political control of workers is still fundamental to the extraction of value. And what has changed is the core business model. So I think it's a change within capitalism, but not a change away from capitalism.
Díky. Mluvil jste o...
Thank you. You said that you still consider this capitalism because of the way it behaves towards the working people. So what does this mean, the platform capitalism, this industrial revolution 4.0 for the labor world? What are the pros and cons? What are the changes for people in gig economies, for example?
Yeah, I think the changes have been overwhelmingly negative. I think it's not entirely negative. I think there are some positive changes that have come from the emergence of new technologies like platforms. But for the most part, the most prominent aspect of these changes has been companies being able to outsource a series of workers that they weren't able to outsource beforehand. So Uber is the classic example here. Instead of being a taxi company that hires taxi drivers, instead they consider themselves to be a platform company which just allows taxi drivers to meet passengers on their platform. This basically means that Uber doesn't have to pay nearly as much in terms of labor costs for these workers. So it's a real cost-saving measure for Uber. The estimates I've seen say that they save around 30% on labor costs as a result of this change. So they don't have to pay for things like unemployment benefits, national insurance, parental leave, or anything like that. So this has been a real the platform business model has been a real boon for the capitalist. It's allowed them to make workers much more precarious, make them much more dependent on the market, provide them with much lower wages than what they would otherwise get. And that, to me, is sort of the overwhelming story of the changes of platform capitalism, is that it has been a net negative for workers. The other key change, I think, has to do with surveillance and the fact that platforms are fundamentally about the collection of data. So another reason why platforms have been so successful in the past decade is because they're a business model which is built to collect as much data as possible. And data in our current economy is not just a source of revenue, but it's also a source of power. So one of the ways in which platform capitalism has changed the nature of work is that surveillance is spreading in in incredibly ubiquitous ways. So if you're an Uber driver, for instance, there's been reports of Uber tracking when individual drivers are going to Uber protests, so they can monitor, who's taking part in these sorts of things. Uber has been tracking government officials. They got caught doing that a few years ago. All this sort of surveillance, which is enabled by the platform. I think that's the other major change which has been brought about by these technologies. So growing precarity with the outsourcing of labor, and then also this increasing amount of surveillance.
Ještě mám jednu otázku k platformám.
I have another question concerning the platforms. Could you please explain what does it mean that companies like Uber, YouTube or Netflix work in loss? They don't have profits. So what happens? What do they do with the money if they are in loss? What does that mean? Because that's against the basic principle of doing business. If something is in loss, not in profit, it doesn't make sense. Could you explain that, please?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting phenomenon. And I think it's something which emerged in the 1990s with the dot-com boom. You started to get this strategy of growth before profits. So the idea being that investors would put money into a company so they would grow larger and larger and larger, come to dominate the market, and eventually the idea is that 10 years down the line, 15 years down the line, those companies will be in a position where they can make huge amounts of profit, and investors will then get their money back as a result. I think that emerged in the 1990s, and it's really taken off in the past decade as well, with companies like Uber and Lyft and Deliveroo and all these sorts of gig economy companies. I think, though, there's one other aspect to sort of mention here, which is that the bottom line of Uber never making a profit, and let's be clear, Uber has never made a profit. It tends to lose billions every single quarter. And right now they're saying they'll get profits next quarter, but that's only going to be through financial manipulation of the accounts. That doesn't mean, though, that they're losing money. It doesn't mean that nobody is benefiting from the situation. So early investors in Uber invest at a low price. That price goes up and they sell it for a high price and they make a huge amount of money off of it. Likewise, the founders of Uber, they put money and resources and time into it at the beginning, and they saw a return on that investment, and huge amounts of money going to the founders of the company. So I think it's worth sort of distinguishing between a series of different groups who are investing within a capitalist company. Some of them may benefit even if the company itself never earns a profit, while others are sort of left holding the bag at the end and having to make up for these billions of dollars of losses every single quarter. So I think it's a complex situation, and the sort of ongoing belief at the moment from investors is that at some point Uber will make money and they'll be okay. I don't think that's actually going to happen, but that's the belief of the investors at least.
Díky. Já bych se teď na chvíli přesunul jako směrem do budoucnosti, protože nás samozřejmě
Let's move forward to the future for a bit, because I believe that everybody would like to know what the future might bring based on these analyses. In Inventing the Future, you say that the main problem of capitalism on its current path are redundant populations. And my question is, just briefly, what exactly do you mean? Does that include only the unemployed or also other groups? And why is it such a problem for capitalism, which, after all, always threw people overboard, and it did not really have a huge impact on its stability? And then, how have the redundant populations developed over the past 5 years since the publication of your book, and were your predictions correct?
Yeah, so a key focus of Inventing the Future is this argument around surplus populations. And it's a concept which comes from Marx in Capital. And he sees surplus populations as, in part, a good thing for capitalism, because it means that when capitalism needs more workers, there's always a group of people who are not working currently and can be brought into the workforce. It also acts as a threat for existing workers. So capitalists can go to an existing worker and basically say, if you don't listen to me and work as hard as possible, I'm going to fire you, and there's 10 people lined up outside to take your spot. So this surplus population serves a function for capitalists within the system. At the same time, and this is one of the core predictions of Marx within Capital Volume 1, is that there is, as we see, a growing automation and use of technology in the production process. On the other hand, we see a growing surplus population. And he calls this the general law of accumulation at one point. And I think it's an argument which has been sort of forgotten for a long period of time, because after World War II, most Western countries ended up having full employment policies, and everybody who was looking for a job, primarily white men, was able to get a job. So this was a situation where unemployment just wasn't a major issue. Now, the tendency, though, is, again, for these surplus populations to grow because of the increasing automation of work and because of the increased efficiencies of the production process. Now, this poses a crisis for capitalism, because if it gets too large, you start to see a social crisis emerging. You start to see people who recognize that capitalism no longer is able to provide for them. And you start to see people realize that this mode of production is fundamentally opposed to not just their interests, but to their actual survival at the extremes. And so that's when it starts to really pose a problem for capitalism on a systemic level. And I think this is interesting, because Marx is traditionally known, when we talk about crisis theory in Marx, we tend to think about the decreasing rate of profit over time. And we tend to think that that's what's going to cause a sort of terminal crisis of capitalism. But actually, I think there's this other story about surplus populations, people being tossed aside from the capitalist economic system. And I think that's also a really important crisis story. And I think it's one which is more and more relevant as we see these technologies emerge, and as we see people being outsourced and people being made increasingly precarious. I think surplus populations is a concept which helps us explain why that's happening and the possible consequences of it.
Thank you. One of the demands in your book, which might help resolve the situation, is the suppression of the ethics of work. My question is, why do you consider this requirement to be of key importance for this crisis? What should we imagine when you say something like that? And how do you do that in practice?
I think it's a really tough question. I think, the eliminating the work ethic, I think, is a really important step, because, when Alex Williams, my co-author, and I were going around talking about the book before it was published, a key thing we would run into was that we'd say, okay, we want to end work. And you get people saying, but, don't some people love work? And it would usually be, I don't really love work, but I know people who do love work. And I think there is this sense that socially we need to work hard, that there's a sort of intrinsic value in this. And I think it's all oriented towards, again, acquiescence to a sort of capitalist system of increasing efficiency and generating more profits for companies. It's so ingrained in us, and I still find it ingrained in myself. And I think if we really want a post-work world, we need to move beyond that sort of work ethic. Now, in a post-work utopia, that doesn't mean that the work ethic is replaced with, say, a lazy ethic. It doesn't mean that post-work would be all about sitting on a couch playing the latest video game. Some people might enjoy that. I would enjoy that. But there's also, there is aspects of human nature which, we collectively want to work together, build projects, and transform nature, society, the institutions and organizations around us. And the issue really is not the end of work per se, so much as the end of wage labor. And I think that's a really crucial distinction that often gets lost in these discussions, is that we want to end wage labor. Wage labor is people without any means of subsistence being forced to go and sell their labor time to somebody who then controls them for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, although increasingly it's spreading far, far beyond that sort of standard time. So this is for us, it's an incredible loss of freedom. A good chunk of your waking life is time given to somebody else where they can tell you what to do, in principle, at any second of the day. This is not freedom in any way. So we can liberate work actually from wage labor, and I think this is one interesting way to think about what post-work means, is that it is work liberated from those constraints, that mode of domination, that lack of freedom, and instead think about, well, what would work mean if it was freely chosen collective projects? What if we had time to develop our skills in the way that we wanted to build the projects that we want to, without having to worry about needing to work 40 hours a week at minimum wage to pay for rent, to pay for food, to pay for childcare, all of this sort of stuff. This is what post-work is fundamentally all about. And I think, I think we'll get into this a little bit later, but fundamentally post-work is about freedom for me. And I think it's the most important value behind the post-work project.
Napadlo mě přitom, že vlastně třeba Amazon.
It crossed my mind that, for example, Amazon has found a way of overcoming work for age by offering vouchers for e-books on its website. And there's another question that follows from that. In the post-work utopia, if labor were to lose the value of a glue that motivates everybody so that we do things from morning to dawn, from dawn to evening, everything that defines the society as we work in it, and if the basic needs in this utopia were to be provided for by unconditional basic income, which is another demand or requirement in your book, what sort of new ethics, in your opinion, might replace this, and why?
I mean, I think on one level, it can't be answered in advance. If a basic principle that you hold yourself to is freedom and the voluntary association of people, you can't sort of dictate in advance what the core sort of projects and ethics of a future post-work, post-capitalist society would be. It's somewhat of a cop-out answer, but I don't think you can sort of say at the moment. I think it would be a bit presumptuous. But again, I think you can imagine quite easily what it might entail. Rather than spending huge amounts of money and intelligence and resources on trying to improve surveillance tech so we get slightly better targeted ads, what if we use all that technology for improving the health of society, improving the health of elderly people so that they can live their lives fuller for longer? What if we were to use all this stuff for, again, increasing our freedoms in various ways? I think that's the sort of thing that I would hope would emerge in a sort of post-capitalist society, is that we start to think collectively not how to make a profit at all costs, and if there's benefits to society, that's completely derivative and secondary, but instead taking the benefits to society as the sort of fundamental thing that we're working towards and that we're building these various projects for. That would be the sort of key goal of a post-capitalist society.
I'm trying to find the societal way towards the objective where I'm able to read books and watch trees all day long. I'm trying to find books that will teach me how to do that.
Jo, já bych se teď vlastně od ekonomiky a společnosti se chtěl zastavit ještě
let's leave economics and the society and talk about an area which hasn't been talked about much in history, and that's households, home. In your partner, Helen Hester, you are working on the book I mentioned at the beginning, After Work, and that is focused on this area, which is something that actually takes up the major part of our lives. And that's labor connected to social reproduction, family care, care of the seniors, housework, and so on. From this point of view, how can you defend the position of post-work? How does it go together? I mean, suppression or elimination of the ethic of works and work that's beneficial in the sense that you give it to your family or you work at home. And to what extent should automation of household chores play a role here?
Yeah, this is one of the sort of key starting points of our book. Is that, when we talk about post-work, when we talk about the end of work, we tend to think about factories, warehouses, offices, sort of traditional workspaces like that. What very rarely gets talked about by post-work thinkers is the home, or hospitals, or nursing homes, or childcare centers. This sort of stuff very rarely gets mentioned by post-work thinkers. And in part, there's sort of good reasons why, because as you mentioned, the most straightforward interpretation of applying post-work to social reproduction would mean that you spend less time caring for your elderly parents who are, not feeling well, or spend less time caring for your children. That's sort of the rudimentary idea of what post-work might mean if we applied it to social reproduction. And clearly that's not, a desirable option. We don't want to reduce the amount of care that's going on. If in many cases there's a severe lack of caring going on, numerous elderly people being left in quite decrepit states, children being neglected, and there's a real deficit of care in many ways. So post-work can't be a simple reduction of care in that way, but it also can't be the automation of care, which is the simplest solution to how do you reduce work is you just get a robot to do it. Putting it very bluntly, if you want logistics work done in a warehouse, let's just get robots to do all of it. That doesn't quite work when you're talking about a nursery or a nursing home or anything like that. I think, first of all, because the technical limitations are immense, we don't have the technologies to do that sort of work. But also there are, very strong moral objections to that sort of thing. And so I think, it can't be a matter of getting robots to do this sort of work either. So our book is all about thinking, well, how do we get around this impasse? How do we apply post-work ideas to social reproduction work? And one of our sort of core starting points, again, is that actually social reproduction work takes up the majority of our working time. So if you look at the amount of wage labor that we do that has to do with social reproduction, whether it be nurses, doctors, teachers, anything like that, and then also the unwaged time that is spent performing social reproductive tasks, it means that basically we end up in a situation where the majority of our work time is spent on reproductive work, and a growing amount of it as well. It's increasing over time. So how do we talk about post-work, and how do we talk about it in the context of this very large body of work, but a large body of work which isn't amenable to the easiest ways of reducing work? And so for us, the answers, I don't want to give away the book entirely, but the answers have to do with things like thinking about various ways of collectivizing the work. So whether it be sort of community associations of parents running nurseries, which has become quite popular in Scandinavian countries. There's some experiments here in the UK as well. You can also have, quite socialized, publicly run childcare, which can be very high quality, and oftentimes in many ways higher quality than what individual parents might be able to offer in terms of education and basic skills and things like that. So thinking about collectivizing this work in various ways is one way to go about thinking about how to apply post-work ideas to social reproduction. And then another key way has to do with the design of physical spaces. So particularly in the Western world, or the vast majority of the Western world, the single family household is the dominant dwelling space. It's the dominant way in which people live, and it's the dominant materiality of the way in which people live. Now, it doesn't have to be that way. And there's various countries, Vienna and Austria is a very good example, of various ways of sort of collectivizing social housing, making it so that the vast duplication of efforts that go on in individual households can actually be reduced by collectivizing it, whether it be cooking, cleaning, or any number of different things. But starting to rethink, beyond sort of individual family home and its archetype in the American suburb, how do we rethink materiality in a way which allows us to reduce work, again, without reducing care necessarily, because that's what we're trying to avoid as well. And I think, that is sort of some basic principles of how we can apply post-work principles to the work of social reproduction.
Ona péče kromě té sféry sociální reprodukce, tak
apart from social reproduction, the care is one of the most growing fields in the labor work. In one of your lectures, you quoted the journalist from New York Times who evaluated the perspective of the US government for the next decade, and he used the word that 9 out of the 12 new emerging positions is how to say nurse or a person who provides care. That's why you often label the new economies as economies of care. That may be care in the gig economy as well. What do you mean by economy of care, and what change will that mean for our society? How should the society adapt based on this new trend?
Yeah, it's a change which I think has been sort of indirectly recognized by some people, but I don't think it's been fully recognized how significant the shift is to advanced capitalist economies, in particular, becoming economies which are oriented around social reproduction as wage labor. I'll give one example, which is when we talk about, the sort of peak of manufacturing, these, massively industrialized countries, Germany, the UK, the US, back in like the 1940s, at their manufacturing peak, the total portion of the population that was working in manufacturing was around 30 to 40% at the upper limits. What we see today is almost every country in the advanced capitalist world, about 30% of people are now working in what we might consider to be social reproduction work. So if we once considered these to be manufacturing countries, I think we now need to consider them to be social reproduction countries and economies. And this is, it's a massive change. I think it's a really important change because, if you're interested in progressive change, the worker has always been a source of that power and that possibility for change. And it's no longer the case that it's a factory worker. It's not been that case for a long time now. But more specifically, I think something like a nurse or a home healthcare aide and the very unique conditions of work that they face, that is a sort of archetype of what work is all about nowadays. So we need to change our image of what the working class is like, increasingly dominated by women. A large proportion of the population tends to be migrants performing this work, sometimes formally for low wages, but oftentimes informally, just sort of getting paid under the table sort of thing. And I think this is a really important correction to, the dominant idea I would say now is that we have service economies or we have information economies. That's not actually the case. The vast majority of the population is not working in programming or IT or anything like that. And services is such a baggy category that lumps bankers together with teachers and says that they're all the same thing. So it's not a service economy. I think that's way too vague to be explaining what's happening to our economies right now. It is a social reproduction economy, or a care economy, if you prefer to call it that. And yeah, I think this is a change which hasn't really been recognized yet, but it's one which is driven by a number of factors that are facing a number of different countries. Crucial is demographics, the fact that so many countries are seeing aging populations now. And as you get aging populations, you get people who are retired, who need to be cared after and looked after for a longer period of time. But you also see dwindling fertility rates in a lot of countries as well, which means that there's less younger people to actually do that sort of work and take care of that. So it means, again, that fewer people to do the work, but more care needed. It means a growing proportion of people end up doing that sort of work. So that's the situation I think we find ourselves in. I think, the implications of it, of this sort of structural change in our economies, I don't think have been spelt out really by anyone yet. But I hope that our book sort of contributes to thinking about politically how we might respond to it. How do you take care of elderly people? How do you take care of children when both parents are working? All these questions are still wide open in most countries. And I think this is something which we need to give thought to.
You mentioned the gender bias of this distribution of care in the economy. Before the pandemic, we talked about the chain of care that explains that a woman can take care of children or she can work and somebody else has to take care of her children. So there's still this burden on the shoulders of women. So that's unrealistic. But the pandemic showed that this chain is coming through more parts of the society. The nurses had to take extra shifts. They were mostly women, so there was double burden on them because they not only worked almost double time, but they also had to take care of their children. They had to be mothers as well. So what should we do with that? What's the perspective of your theory in this aspect?
Yeah, I think the sort of key thing from the pandemic is that it made a lot of people who might have been unaware of the burdens of this work and, let's say, the sort of social functions of schools. They're not just for education. Schools are also for childcare and allowing parents to then go out and work. When those things shut down, suddenly that sort of truth of the situation gets revealed to a lot of people who probably weren't aware of it, at least not to the same degree as they were after the pandemic. So I think that huge burden of work that was suddenly forced onto households, particularly parents and families, I think that is a real moment that politically can be built upon. People have a living experience of these sorts of burdens and the necessity of having institutions and a society that's organized around providing some of this work in relatively efficient ways. So I think it's the main thing, at least in these terms, from the pandemic, has been the sort of recognition of this stuff. In terms of the gender bias, it was men basically taking up some of the work and women taking up the majority of the work on average. All of the research I've seen on that says that that was basically the way it went. Men took up some of it, women took up most of the work. So that gender bias, again, I think is becoming more and more prominent. And, you know, in many ways, there's a real concern that some of the progress that women have seen in breaking down the gender division of labor over the past 20, 30 years, that might have been rolled back by the pandemic. So, you know, what happened during the pandemic when children were coming home? In many cases, it was the women who were, you know, taking a pause on their job, taking a pause on their career to then look after children, and giving up on sort of the benefits that they may have had. So, yeah, the pandemic, I think, is you know, it's made a terrible situation worse in many ways, but it's also made it more visible to a lot of people, I think. So there is some potential in that.
I have another question that concerns the relation of technologies and households. How did it happen that the continuous growth of technologies that are meant to simplify housework did not shorten the time that you dedicate to housework as such?
Yeah, there's a really famous work in the 1970s on exactly this sort of issue, and particularly the work of Ruth Schwartz Cohen, has now come to be known as Cohen's paradox, which is, on the one hand, we've seen over the course of the 20th century, in many ways, an industrialization of the home. So the emergence of washing machines, dishwashers, fridges, freezers, you know, microwaves, all these technologies which are apparently labor-saving devices. So they're supposed to ease the burden of, say, doing laundry and things like that. But what Cohen found in the 1970s was that when she actually studied how much time was being spent on household work, that it had virtually stayed the same from 1900 to the 1970s. Despite all the new technology, despite all the labor-saving devices, women were still doing the same amount of housework in the home. And so the question became, well, why is this? You know, why isn't this these technologies saving any labor time? And there's a few different answers. One I think is really important, which is standards around these things started to get ratcheted up. So the clearest example of this is doing laundry. Laundry before the washing machine was an incredibly burdensome piece of work. You know, it would take all day to do it, and it was often done collectively because it was just so laborious. But it wasn't done that often. Whereas once you have the washing machine, suddenly it became physically easier to do it and more convenient. But then the standards and the expectations of how often you're supposed to be washing your clothes also went up. So people ended up washing their clothes more often, even if any given time it didn't take you know, as much as it used to. So standards go up and people spend more and more time on these tasks. The other major change was that this sort of reproductive labor, you know, in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, was, if you were working class, it was often done collectively. So the neighbors would all get together to share in childcare, share in cleaning, share in cooking, and things like that. If you were wealthier, you'd have a domestic servant to come in and do it. And the domestic servant industry was massive in the early 1900s. You know, I think around 15% of the population was a domestic servant in many countries. Now, with the emergence of these new domestic technologies, that all sort of disappears. And the work all gets pushed into an individual home done by an individual housewife. And so the work which had once been collectivized in many ways was now individualized, which meant more work for that particular person, which was typically a mother. So, you know, these are some of the key reasons why labor-saving devices didn't actually save any labor. I think, you know, the key sort of takeaways of this is that technology in itself is not sufficient for a post-work world. We need to think about the social organization. We need to think about normative expectations. We need to think about all these different aspects which have nothing to do intrinsically with technology, but they do shape the ways in which technology is used, the ways in which it's designed, and the ways in which it's deployed across a particular society. Now that continues today, I think. The smart home, for instance, is promised as being a sort of labor-saving technology. Simply walk up to your door. You don't have to fumble for your keys or anything. You simply have like a little chip in your watch and you hold it up to the door. All of this is supposed to be a matter of saving time, but if you've ever actually used a smart home device, they are an incredibly burdensome technology to use. Trying to get all these technologies to work together, trying to get these things, the security updates working, it doesn't save time at all. It might have other benefits, but the smart home is not a labor-saving device in any way.
And if I were to adopt the IKEA idea of an apartment of the future, how would the household of the future be like? What would it look like?
Yeah, it's an incredibly difficult question. I will say that in most corporate imaginations of what the future home is supposed to look like, there is a massive change in technology, and there's all sorts of ways in which, again, little conveniences are supposed to be made more and more ubiquitous. But the gender relations actually change very, very little. And when you look at, IKEA's imagination of the future or Microsoft's imagination of the future, it continues to be, women concerned about fashion and cooking and cleaning, men concerned with playing and TV and, barbecuing. The gender imagination of these things is just quite appalling. It's like everything can change except for gender relations. So I think that's a real problem with these visions of the future, is that actually, again, it's not just the technology that we need to be thinking about in the future, but the social organization of this labor, the ways in which this labor is equitably distributed amongst genders, amongst individuals, amongst households. All of that is absolutely essential as well. And, I think more speculatively, there's been some really interesting surveys which go and ask people, of all these sort of fantastical technologies that we could imagine 30 years down the line, what is the one that you want the most? And repeatedly, people come back and say, I want a house that self-cleans. A house where you didn't have to do dusting or vacuuming or anything like that, which is just somewhat impossible, at least at the present moment. But I think if we were to really imagine speculatively what an ideal home in the future would look like, it would include, a self-cleaning aspect as well.
Okay, let's quickly check the time. Before we give a chance to the audience, I would like to cover one more area. It's a political area. You openly declare that you are a leftist, you are on the left, and your thoughts also coincide with the left movement, and you believe that the new project is a necessary precondition for the survival of a free society. Here in the Czech Republic, intellectuals do not do that much. They do not associate with a political profile because they are afraid that they would lose their neutrality or objectivity in the eyes of the public. I myself do it, and I would like to use this opportunity because we have someone from the West, in inverted commas, someone who does do that. And I would like to openly ask, can you explain to us why you are a leftist and with regard to today's topic, why is it that the left has functional recipes for the challenges that we have mentioned?
Yeah, it's a really good fundamental question. And I think it's one that, whatever your political inclinations, you should have some sort of good answer to. I think, for me, the right the conservative perspective, is fundamentally about the preservation of a particular hierarchy of social relations. Now, what that particular hierarchy of social relations is varies. It could be a gendered hierarchy, it could be a racial hierarchy, it could be, a hierarchy of classes. But conservative thought is all about the preservation of one of these sort of particular hierarchical visions of society. Now, for me, the left fundamentally is about freedom, which is somewhat contested, somewhat contentious to say even in the West, because when people talk about freedom, they typically mean freedom of the market. They mean freedom to go to a supermarket and pick and choose, what sort of juice or dishwasher detergent you want. And that's what a lot of people tend to mean by freedom. But it's such a naive and simplistic and insubstantial concept of freedom when we're just talking about consumer choice as being what freedom is all about. Freedom includes political freedom, and economic freedom, and social freedom, and all these other aspects. And freedom is fundamentally about taking down systems of domination and oppression. And this is why I consider myself to be on the left, is because I want to build a world of freedom for a universal group of people. So it's not limited to men. It's not limited to the natives of a particular country. It is freedom for everybody. And for me, the left project is not only the sort of expansion of that freedom to everybody, but also the increase in freedom for everybody. So this is where my sort of anti-capitalist thinking comes from, because for me, as I mentioned earlier, capitalism is fundamentally a system of domination. It's domination very clearly for workers. You give up 40 hours of your week where you just let somebody else tell you exactly what you have to do. That is not freedom. That is fundamentally a matter of domination and oppression. And the situation that we've got ourselves in, where we think because it's ostensibly a voluntary contract between an employee and an employer, that therefore it's free, it's not. It's a relationship of domination. And as a leftist, I want to figure out ways to get beyond that. But capitalism is also a system of domination actually for capitalists as well. And this is why, the sort of moral critique of capitalism, that people are simply too greedy, that if we replaced, Mark Zuckerberg with somebody nicer, we might get a better version of capitalism, is fundamentally flawed. Because capitalism is an impersonal structure which compels individuals in particular situations to search after profit. To, if you're the head of Facebook, no matter what, you make your money from advertising, you make your money from surveillance, and you make your money from impinging on people's privacy. It doesn't matter if it's Mark Zuckerberg there or somebody else. The entire system compels whoever is in that position to act in that sort of way. So capitalism is a system of domination for capitalists because it forces them, on pain of going bankrupt or losing all their money, it forces them to act in particular ways, which may actually be against their moral inclinations. So this is, I think capitalism is fundamentally a system of constraints in many, many ways. It might have been an improvement on feudalism, but it still remains a system of massive constraints on our freedoms. And I refuse to think that we cannot do anything better than a situation where the vast majority of the world is subject to the dictatorial whims of, your boss for 40 hours a week. I think we can do better. So I think we can build freedom, and I think we can expand it to everybody. And for me, that's what being on the left is all about.
Thank you. And I have one more question. How do you deal with the political consequences of the end of work or after work concept for the traditional left, that is, for the parties who actually have the word labor or work in their name, Labour Party, for example? How can the Labour Party suppress the ethics of work? How can a Labour Party demand full unemployment?
Yeah, it's I often joke that I think the Labour Party should rename itself as the Post-Labour Party, but nobody's taken me up on that yet, unfortunately. But I think it does point to an interesting aspect, and I think the issue is labor parties and social democratic parties in the sort of more broad framework, they're supposed to represent the working class. They're supposed to represent workers. And the question becomes, and this is actually, it's a massive intellectual debate that's been going on for a century, but the question is, what is the interest of workers? Is it to find dignity in wage labor, and to try and find ways to improve work as it is right now? So getting things like higher pay and various sort of safety nets and things like that, but not fundamentally changing that very structure of work. So there's a long tradition which says that this is what the interest of workers should be, is all about the dignity of work. And then there's the tradition that I come from, that I find most persuasive, which is that actually, the working class is a category which is determined and driven by capitalism. The proletariat is a category which came about with the emergence of capitalism. And if we go beyond capitalism, the proletariat as a social category doesn't exist anymore. And I think the mistake that the first group of thinkers make is that they take the particular interest of the proletariat under capitalism as universal interest and trans-historical interest beyond capitalism. Whereas I don't think that's actually the case. I think that we have aspects of ourselves that are separate, distinct from being a proletariat, and fundamentally have to do with freedom, because freedom is the ability to choose to do what you will with the time that you have. And it's not just a matter of making, your 40-hour work week a bit more pleasant. It's about abolishing that 40-hour work week so that you can then do the projects that you want to do and sleep in when you want to sleep in, and help out your family or your community or whatever it might be when you want to. So for me, this I think that the idea that labor parties are only about, or necessarily only about sort of improving the dignity of work, I think is historically accurate. This is what they have done, but I don't think it's a necessary sort of way in which they have to be. I think they can take up a project of freedom and start to sort of, crack open these ways beyond capitalism, and start to think about ways of getting freedom beyond capitalism.
Díky.
Thank you. Now, I have a sort of sub-question. I would like to ask Ji.hlava. It relates to the Czech social democracy. Their think tank had you translated, so they probably want you to tell them what to do next, because that's the phase they're in right now. That party in the recent years has been presenting itself as exclusively a defender of the welfare state. So logically, the question is, if you're talking about basic income, the post-work world, how does welfare state fit into that category? Because the left was used to defending that for the past decades. So what do we do with the remains of the welfare state in theory?
Yeah, I think the welfare state is absolutely essential. I think the key sort of thing is to think about how to update it for the 21st century. And the challenge is that in many ways this is a country by country sort of political challenge. What I might say for the UK would differ from the advice that should be offered to Germany, and differ from the advice that would be offered to Czech Republic or anybody else. That being said, I think there are some basic principles when we're thinking about what the welfare state should be all about. And fundamentally for me, the welfare state should be about reducing market dependency. So this is the idea that fundamental to the origins of capitalism was that you would shove people off the land where they were able to live and have their lives outside of a market. Once you shove them off the land, they suddenly have to go to the labor market and find a job. And that's, one of the major ways in which capitalism was started. That dependency on the market is something that welfare states can really help with. So, simple things like unemployment benefits and various things like that. Universal basic income is, again, a really good example of that, simply because if it was properly implemented, fundamentally, workers wouldn't have to be dependent on the labor market at all. And this would be a huge expansion of freedom. Imagine if you didn't have to go and find a job in order to make your rent at the end of the month, or in order to, buy groceries this week. That would be a huge change in the mindsets of workers, but also the political potential of workers as well, if you're no longer dependent on the market. So I think that's one thing that welfare states can do, is reduce that dependency. The other thing is a sort of general principle of trying to increase the autonomy and power of the working classes. And for me, this is, the sort of guiding principle to a lot of my thinking about this sort of stuff, is that I may not necessarily, have an answer for how to get from A to B exactly, but I do believe in the potential of the working class to be able to choose and determine their own path forward in progressive manners. And I think any sort of welfare state option which increases the autonomy of workers is a really important step to take. One example I'll give is healthcare in the US, where right now, if you want healthcare in the United States, for most people, you have to have a job and you have to have an employer which provides you with healthcare, which then ties you to that employer, ties you to that work. And you become quite fearful of leaving that job because you don't know if you're going to get another job and get health insurance. There's all sorts of additional risks that happen because it's such a market-led system of healthcare in the United States. If, however, they brought in a more universal healthcare system, something like the NHS, suddenly the autonomy of workers to do what they want and choose their own appropriate course of action, that would improve immensely. So I think, things like this, universal healthcare, ending market dependency, all of that is general principles about what the welfare state can do. And I think it has to reflect, the sort of conditions on the ground of a particular country. The welfare state in most countries was built after World War II. You had an economic system of high productivity, high growth, high wages in many places. And you also had a gender division of labor where men were going to work and women were staying at home to look after children and take care of elderly parents and cook and clean and do all of that. In most countries, that gender system no longer exists, and I don't think it should exist. But you also have, different circumstances of economic growth, of productivity growth, and that also lays out different conditions for what's possible with the welfare state. So, I think the answer is it's quite specific to an individual country and an individual circumstance. But I do think the welfare state serves an important role in trying to build a better world effectively.
Thank you. And I think it's time to bring in the audience. So now I'm going to ask you to raise your hand, and we're going to have mics on the sides, and people will bring you mics, and you will say your question in your question of choice. But I don't see the raised hands because there's a floodlight pointing at my face. I have a simple question. I would like to ask, how do we fight for and promote the vision of universal income, basic income, in the framework of the vision of a dark future of the climatic catastrophe, when we won't be distributing any else than daily shares of water, when all the wealth will be gone? Thank you.
Já to asi nebudu nevím, jestli to mám reprodukovat.
Do I have to say it again, or did you hear it, Nick?
Jo, takže otázka zněla...
I heard, yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, I mean, if we jump ahead to that sort of apocalyptic scenario, I think, you know, a lot of discussions around welfare state redistribution and things like that go out the window. I think at that point, there's more fundamental issues around mutual aid and survival and things like that. I hope that we're, you know, quite a ways away from that sort of scenario. You know, I think the future that's brought about by climate change is not going to be pleasant in any way, but I think that sort of quite a vision is a fair ways away, and hopefully we never reach that sort of stage. But I think, you know, more general point is that climate change has to be at the thinking as well. It's something which is reshaping, you know, every single of what is politically possible over the next few decades. And I think, you know, trying to take into account the ways in which the right are responding to it, you know, increasing focus on borders, increasing xenophobia, you know, increasing sort of blame on anyone but ourselves. All of that is going to increase over the coming decades. And the left is going to also be acting in a context where change is bringing dramatic natural changes, social changes, and political changes as well. So it is sort of the fundamental condition when we start thinking about, you know, in the coming decades, what can and can't be done.
Jo, tamhle vystřelila ruka.
I see a hand in the back. Close to the last one.
Dobrý den.
Hello. I would like to ask, there's one thing I don't understand, and that's motivation. Motivation of the people who will be receiving universal basic income, and also the motivation of the entrepreneurs and the businesses who will have to pay for this whole thing. So, what's the motivation for people to do anything at all in this scenario?
Yeah, it's funny because, you know, if you look at management literature of the past 30 years, it's dominated by the idea that, you know, one of the worst ways to motivate people is through money. And actually, we're supposed to be managing people by inspiring them in various ways. And I think that's what, you know, that's what most people want to do. You know, when they go on the weekend, most people don't just simply sit around doing nothing. They have various hobbies, they have various things that they want to do, and they go and do them. I think we also have two really good examples of groups of people who receive something like a universal basic income, and they're good examples of continuing to be motivated. One is retired people receiving a pension where they simply don't have to work. And in most cases, a lot of retired people end up going and doing charity work and, you know, hanging out with friends and traveling, doing all of this sort of stuff. My other favorite example of a group that receives something like a universal basic income and continues to do things is the British monarchy. You know, they're a really good example where they don't have to work at all. Yet they continue to have projects that they're involved in and continue to do things. If it's good enough for the British monarchy, I think it's good enough for the working class.
Jo, první byla ruka tamhle.
The first hand was in the back, next to the column.
Dobrý den. Děkuji moc za debatu. Já jsem se chtěl zeptat.
Hello, thank you for the discussion. I want to ask,
tento nějaký
how can it work? How can this way of economic thinking work at a time of war?
Válečného soupeření s někým.
Or when there's a war clash with someone else?
Yeah, I mean, you know, fortunately, we've lived through a historically long period of peace. All of us are extremely fortunate to have seen relatively little major conflict, and certainly nothing on the scale of World War II or World War I. But of course, that threat of conflict, I think, always exists. And, you go back and you read people before World War I talking about, oh, how great this peace has been and how it's going to last forever. And of course, it didn't. So I think that threat of war and conflict is something we should always be aware of. I will say, I think, wars are exceptional periods and they don't last forever. And the example of World War II is a case where during the war, the provision of social reproduction by the governments actually increased massively. So food being prepared by the government and delivered to people by the government, childcare being organized by the government, elderly care being organized by the government and provided by the government. So World War II is a really interesting case where actually, a lot of these sort of ideas around post-work and trying to reduce the amount of labor did take place in some ways. And of course, what you had after World War II was that in most countries, there was a general acceptance of giving back to the working class. This was in part to ward off more radical demands, but it was still a significant step forward from what existed, in the interwar period or prior to World War I. Workers suddenly had much more autonomy. They had much less market dependency. It's not to say that the outcomes of any significant battle or conflict are going to be positive, but I think it's not necessarily to say that they'll be negative either. I think the sort of impacts of any potential conflict would be difficult to discern in advance.
Letos je tady tak apokalypticky naladěné publikum, jsem si všiml.
We seem to have a very apocalyptic audience this year. We have another hand right here, just behind the screen.
Já bych asi počkal na mikrofon kvůli záznamu. Yep.
Let's wait for the mic.
Jo, taky moc děkuji za debatu.
Thank you for the debate.
Já jsem se chtěl zeptat, vy v té knížce
And I have a question.
píšete o tom, že
In Inventing the Future, you say that the left should master a higher degree of ideological flexibility to be able to win more battles in the struggle for hegemony. Over the last 5 years since the book came out, have you seen any examples? We haven't seen that many in the Czech Republic, I believe. So is there anything that you can tell us about from the West?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I think if we restrict ourselves just to political parties, we've not seen much anywhere, either in the Czech Republic or in the West. I think, perhaps on a political party level, some of the most interesting stuff has been, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the U.S., who I think does really interesting presentations and performances of a particular ideological structure, which draw in people who may not have necessarily been intrigued by that sort of thing beforehand. So that's one interesting case, but on a sort of substantive level, there's not really been much. In many ways, what we've seen, I think, over the past 5 years in most countries is a growing polarization of society between ostensibly people on the left and ostensibly people on the right. There's been less and less sort of ways of trying to bring these different groups together and recognizing common interests. I haven't seen much of it, unfortunately.
In this country, the parties on the left have been much too ideological in the wrong sense of the word. Okay, I can see another hand in the middle. Thank you. I wanted to come back to the beginning of our debate and the issue of the largest companies who pay the lowest or zero taxes. In this respect, how do you view the current initiative, the attempt to introduce, let's say, minimum world tax and the simplification of the tax basis? Because without that, the minimum rate would be pointless. Do you see any other ways of fighting that? And tax is paid on the basis of a profit that can be spent in a flexible way. Shouldn't there be, therefore, also some sort of minimum tax on turnover? If a company gains $1 billion and spends $1 billion, maybe there should be at least a minimum percentage of turnover tax.
Yeah, I'm not opposed to a turnover tax. I think there's some value in it. I think the recent OECD work around a minimum global corporation tax, it's interesting ideologically because 10 years ago, 20 years ago, I think it would have been deemed impossible to get some sort of global cooperation on that particular issue. From what I remember, I think it only affects actually a handful of countries like Ireland and some others who actually have a lower tax rate than what the global minimum is going to be. So the global minimum is still going to be very low, lower than almost every country in the world. But it does set that minimum baseline, and it sets a limit to the sort of race to the bottom that we've seen in some countries. So it's a good step. I don't think it's going to be massively significant, but it is a good step. I think more interesting proposals have to do with recognizing the inherently global nature of a lot of these companies, particularly the tech companies, and taxing them as such. So the idea being to tax them as a global entity and then have the distribution of those revenues to various countries allocated in various sort of equitable and justifiable ways. If it's just based on profits and things like that, it's all these companies move their profits to offshore centers and low tax regions, and simply get taxed very little. But I think there are some more radical proposals about a sort of I think it's called a unitary tax, if I'm remembering it correctly, where it would just be a tax on them as a global corporation and then allocated to various countries. I think that is it recognizes the 21st century nature of capitalism, which is that these companies aren't national in any meaningful way. They are fundamentally global, first and foremost.
Thank you. I can see another hand. Thank you for the debate. I have a question about the concept of post-work and how can that be applied to third world countries? Because we've been talking mainly about the rich Western countries, and they certainly do have the means to introduce a similar system in time. However, once we start talking about poor countries, they do not have the capital and therefore do not have that many means of introducing unconditional income. How do you use this idea in that context? Thank you.
Yeah, so I think there's two sorts of things to respond to. I think, on one level is pointing to the fact that when capitalism comes into a country, it is incredibly disruptive of traditional ways of living. And it's resisted at every step of the way by indigenous populations, by the local populations. So I think, this already points to the fact that there is nothing natural or desirable or inherent about wage labor under capitalism for these developing economies. The other aspect I would say is that these countries are also actually the ones that are most at risk of things like automation. So various studies have looked at, the impact of automation in the rich world and also in the developing world. And it's the developing world where automation is going to take more jobs. And if you sort of stop and think about it, it makes sense, because what jobs have been outsourced to these developing economies? They've been low-wage, routine jobs, so things like factory work, things like call center work, things like IT work. That's all work which can actually be automated quite easily. And as the wages in China, India, Indonesia, the Philippines grow, that's going to make automation more and more viable for companies. So a lot of jobs that currently exist in these developing economies are at risk of automation. I think the highest figure I've ever seen was 85% of Ethiopia's jobs are at risk of automation. So I think the problem that is sort of solved by post-work is more intense in these countries. Now, can they afford to do things like a universal basic income? I think there are real issues that have to do with the massive imbalance of power between the rich and the poor in the world. But there are also a huge amount of examples of universal basic income in Brazil, I think in Rwanda, and in some other countries, where universal basic income has significant impacts in the various experiments that have been tried. And in part it's because, given purchasing power, the amount that is given to people doesn't have to be as much as it might be in a Western country. So I do think there is potential for universal basic income in these economies. I think they face the problems that post-work is trying to respond to. I think they face those problems very acutely. And I think there is a sort of natural resistance against wage labor. It's not something which many people have very willingly accepted. It's always been resisted whenever capitalism moves into a new area.
Tak další otázka.
More questions? Over there, Tadeáš.
Já bych to rád vrátil k
I would like to come back to the first response about climatic change. You said that we need to take this crisis into consideration in any political decision-making. In the world where we have a lot of energy and material consumption, the vision of post-work that you present is based on full automation. Therefore, more machines, more energy, and more material. Therefore, I'm asking whether the post-work vision that you work with is based on material and energy flows, or what makes you certain that on top of the climate collapse, or it will not actually increase or make worse the climate collapse, climate breakdown?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. So I think, full automation is a very provocative claim. And in the book, we try and qualify the various ways in which full automation just simply can't occur. So it's not, really about trying to automate everything and get robots to do everything. But I will say there are, many cases where the automation of work can actually make it more efficient and as a result, less materially impactful. There's no guarantee to that, and I absolutely agree that there's no certainty that automation in every case is going to be environmentally beneficial, but I think there are cases where it can be. The more important point for me, though, is that post-work it's fundamentally a rejection of this endless growth model of capitalism, and this is what has been driving climate change, is the endless cycle of accumulation. If we don't have to work in order to survive, then suddenly we don't need to have 3% economic growth every year. We don't have to be, trying to tear up oil and frack everywhere in order to try and get the economy to continue growing, because people have their basic subsistence met. They have their basic needs met. And if they want to go above and beyond that, well, then there are various ways in which they can do that, and we can try and orient that around sustainable, modes of production. But actually, taking away that impulse that a society needs 3% growth every year, otherwise it risks conflict, and the government risks being unelected. If we take away that impulse, I think that is an incredibly powerful mechanism that would then allow us a lot more leverage over stopping climate change and sort of mitigating it as much as possible. So I think that's fundamental. And there's also various studies which point out that if we all worked less, we'd use less energy. Much less commuting, much less factories running, much less offices with computers and lights and everything on. All of this could lead to significant reductions in the amount of energy that's used by a society. And let me make one final point, which is that I think there is, particularly in sort of ideas of luxury communism, there's sometimes a sense in which what post-work means is just we get to endlessly consume. And I don't think that's the right way to think about post-work, post-capitalism, or abundance. Abundance is, having free time to be able to choose to do what we want to do. And simply buying more and more consumer goods in order to continue an economic system which is harming the environment is not what post-work or post-capitalism should be all about. All that being said, the point about automation, I completely agree with, and perhaps in the book we put it a bit too strongly and didn't consider the environmental aspects sufficiently. So I do think it's a really important point.
Thank you very much for this confrontation. Looking at the clock, I can see that we have a minute left, but because we started slightly late, we can have one more final question, if there is one. Thank you. About financing. Because less people working means less income to the state budget. How will the universal income be financed then? Does it mean higher taxes for those who are working, which is demotivating for the people? How will all that be financed? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get into a massive discussion about monetary politics or anything like that. But of course, taxes on working, on workers are not the only taxes available to governments. Taxes on wealth, taxes on consumption, taxes on carbon and pollution and things like that. There are a variety of other options where governments can raise revenue. And ultimately, I'm not a modern monetary theorist by any means, but I think MMT does have a strong point that actually government debt is not all that significant. That its significance has been played up massively, particularly in the wake of the 2008 crisis. But it's not all that significant, particularly for countries which have monetary sovereignty, have control over their own currency. That is different for countries in the euro, obviously, but there's a whole sort of separate conversation to be had about that. But I don't think financing and revenues is necessarily any sort of insurmountable thing. If we want to find ways to raise revenue, we can. There are plenty of options available.
Okay, thank you. And I think that now we have to conclude our session. Therefore, first of all, thanks to Nick. We appreciate the fact that you joined us. For me, it's also an honor, and I hope that for all of you, it has been inspiring enough. It will inspire further thoughts, because we have opened up a number of hypothetical issues or questions for a further debate about post-work. Therefore, these discussions will continue on the margins of this festival, I'm sure. And thanks to Inspiration Forum for inviting us, and I can't think of anything else to say, so thank you very much.